Ed Miliband says Britain's future is with the European Union. He's ruled out a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU. More powers are transferred to Brussels.
There will be no transfer of powers without an in-out referendum, without a clear choice about whether Britain will stay in the EU.
What is clear is under Labour won't be a referendum. The only way to get an in-out referendum and a proper renegotiation of Britain's position in Europe, reform in Europe, the only way to get that is to have the Conservatives in government.
Let's talk to Persson. He joins me from our studios at Westminster. He is from the think tank Open Europe. Afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Has Ed Miliband helped or hindered, in your opinion?
Well, it depends from whose perspective, I suppose. But I think there will be some people who want this. Perhaps some businesses will what they see as a bit more certainty, perhaps from Labour's point of view, in them effectively ruling out the referendum. And perhaps some people in Europe as well welcome this. But I think you will also have a bit of confusion here in the UK, particularly from a voter's point of view, where I think a lot of people will ask, what exactly has Miliband promised us? Is he saying that in future we will have to choose between more centralization in Europe or absolute thing, withdrawing from the EU altogether, which is effectively the implication of his promise? And I think most voters probably want something in between. They want a middle ground. They want to stay in a heavily reformed European Union. In that sense, Ed Miliband's promise today offers them actually very little.
I mean, what he was talking about doesn't mean that were there to be a Labour government, that government couldn't still try to reform things within Europe, try to tweak issues, to negotiate improvements, refinements. I mean, he hasn't said, I'm never going to ask for improvements within the system. So, I mean, he could still go in and do that. Oh,
indeed, he could. And I think many people will probably welcome his commitment to European reform. He said quite clearly today that he is not backing the status quo to see changes in Europe. But the problem he has is, much like David Cameron, the European Union will be predominantly occupied by fixing the currency, which the UK is not part of, and it's not clear what will trigger those changes in Europe that Miliband wants to see. For David Cameron, on the other hand, whether we agree or disagree with his referendum pledge, it will be a referendum, so therefore there will have to be some sort of negotiations in Europe ahead of that referendum. So in that sense, he at least have an avenue for reform, which Miliband doesn't have. And I think that's Miliband's problem at the moment. There's a bit of a gap there between what he's saying that he's committed to, which is reform, and what he effectively promises the British public, which is a choice between all or nothing.
I mean, he is saying we should be in the EU. We effectively, as a nation, on balance, benefit from being members of the EU, and that is how it should remain. So that's fairly clear, isn't it?
That is clear, but what I think he's sort of failing to engage with somewhat is that the EU itself is changing. The Eurozone, the countries that share the single currency, they are pressing ahead with more integration. They are starting to do more things in common. That in itself is changing the very nature of the EU, which will have a knock-on effect on the UK. For example, there's a risk now that the Eurozone starts to write the rules for all 28 member states, including the UK, but with those member states who do not share the currency having very limited impact on these decisions. The changing nature of Europe means that the status quo is not an option. So if Miliband wants to stay in the EU, he needs to explain to us how he will ensure that the public confidence in the EU can continue to be in place as the EU itself is going through profound changes, which will have an impact on the UK as well.
Persson, the director of the think tank Open Europe, thank you very much for now.
Thank you.